Good morning, Wabash. This morning it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Kubiak. Dr. Kubiak earned his bachelor's degree in classics from Loyola University in 1972 and his master's degree and PhD from Harvard. He came to Wabash in 1979 as a professor of classics, and he's currently the acting department chair. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kubiak in his chapel talk, Viva, Wabash, or Why Gender Feminism is Killing Our College.
Thanks very much. The first thing I want to check is the mic. Can you hear me? Because it used to be this mic was very strange. Good. Thanks, Doug, and thanks to the club for the invitation. You see that I have my own Sphinx Club pot right here, which I was given several years ago when the fellows were nice enough to make me an honorary member. It's in my office next to my Greek lexicon, and I think that's a nice sort of Wabash symbol. The first thing I want to do is it occurs to me that perhaps this is the first public gathering since last Saturday, is to congratulate very heartily and warmly our football squad and Coach Creighton for the spectacular year that they've given us. I didn't expect to be addressing you here today. As Professor Webb has mentioned now several times in print, towards the end of last semester, he and I received letters from a superior expressing displeasure at the things that we had been saying to the community and suggesting that we not speak in the way that we had been about controversial issues. Earlier this semester, a similar request was made to me by another member of the administration, this time in person. Now, many of my friends urged me to consider these actions as intolerable assaults on academic freedom, but that really wasn't my attitude. I was dealing with colleagues that I'd known for over 20 years, and so was minded to consider their requests as advice based on a prudential judgment about the current state of the college. So I had no particular difficulty in complying. But there was always an unspoken proviso in this agreement. I would stop speaking in public if the administration could keep my perennial ideological opponents under wraps as well. Well, it's now apparent that the administration is not able to do this. We have seen over the last months, and actually began last year, the most sustained attack by gender feminist faculty on Wabash students in my memory. As I told my friend Professor Rosenberg, I wish he had given different advice to the new members of his team, since the nuclear option had been triggered for me by Professor Kinane's October letter to the bachelor. In my naturally aggressive masculine mind, attack supposes defense. In addition, I encountered a number of students, among them some of the finest young men on this campus, who were angry and depressed after the letter appeared, but had no way to express their feelings. A colleague told me that one fellow in his C&T section was so upset that he had to leave class on the Friday after the letter appeared. I imagine this talk then as a way to give such students, and many others who have spoken to me in the last month, a public voice that they feel they have been effectively deprived of by the current political tenor of the college. But I do wish to make it quite clear that I am speaking today not in contempt of the administration's wishes, but with the obvious conviction that there cannot be a debate on an issue if one side is muzzled and the other isn't. Additionally, I ask your indulgence right at the start for the length of this talk, which is perhaps a little greater than the norm for these Thursday chapels, but I have a lot to say. I begin by noting that I certainly appreciate everyone who took the time to come out in the snow today, but this talk is directed to our students. So whenever I say you, that's who I mean, the students of Wabash College. I do this to draw attention to my feeling that over the past few years, the student body has been subtly decentered in the larger Wabash picture. I'm not an alumnus of this school, as you heard. So everything that I know and value about it, I learned from senior colleagues when I arrived. Chiefly Eric Dean, who was professor of religion and longtime chair of my division, and Lou Salter, professor of physics and at that time the president of the college. What they taught me, or better to say what they showed me, was that the relationship between faculty and students that we strove for then was a perfect example of what the German theologian Martin Buber famously called the I-thou dialogue. A good definition of what that means is this. The I-thou relation is a direct interpersonal relation which is not mediated by any intervening system of ideas. No objects of thought intervene between I and thou. Thus, I-thou is not a means to some object or goal, but is an ultimate relation involving each subject, end quote. What I think I've been seeing of late is the gradual interposing of two systems of ideas, two filters, if you will, between the faculty I and the student thou. The first is the filter of the liberal arts. This one says that you are interesting to us because you provide evidence about a certain kind of teaching, which can then be analyzed, summarized, and passed on to other institutions, as if any other college could be Wabash. The second filter is that of gender feminism. Its program is more ominous. Because you are men, and mostly Midwestern men, and mostly having traditional ideas about what it means to be a man, you become examples of what the ideology of gender feminism hates the most, and you are thus useful for purposes of political agitation. This change in perspective about you becomes quite vivid when one observes the increasingly common use of a certain word when people talk about Wabash. Recently, the respected thinker on education, Lee Shulman, said during a visit here, "Think of this campus as a laboratory, a lab for human learning." And in the details article about us, Professor Castro is quoted as thinking that we are sitting in this gender laboratory, so it's fascinating for gender theorists to work in. Let the first point that I make in this talk then be a call for an immediate end to this dehumanizing language. You did not come here, gentlemen, to be treated like lab rats. This attitude towards you is offensive, and it should stop. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You probably want to find out what the Viva Wabash part of my title is about. As some of you know, I had surgery this summer in Chicago to repair a severed Achilles tendon, and I recuperated in a studio apartment on Lakeshore Drive that my sister keeps as a photo darkroom. For the first month, I was in a Vicodin-induced fog that thoroughly upset my circadian rhythms, and I found myself staying up until dawn and sleeping well past noon. Now, the apartment had cable television, which I can't get at home here in the woods, so I discovered for the first time MTV. I had heard the name, certainly, but I had never seen it. Now, most of what was on it was simply unpleasant noise, but I did become strangely fascinated with a show that aired around 1:30 a.m. titled Viva La Bam. The star is a former member of the Jackass gang, a skateboard virtuoso called Bam Margera, and the action consists of him and his friends doing various completely outrageous things to members of his family. His father and mother, Phil and April, who is affectionately known as Ape, and his uncle, the verbally challenged Don Vito, who must surely be one of the great comic discoveries in contemporary pop culture. The program interested me first from the point of view of genre, since it belongs to that peculiar oxymoronic form, the scripted reality show. But I couldn't figure out what about it beyond that I found so engaging. And then one night it hit me. Viva La Bam is the masculine equivalent of the vagina monologues, only in much better taste. It is a celebration of unfettered masculine instincts and attitudes, which inspire either amusement or horror in women, but are not at all a part of their psychic world. Women are much too intelligent and self-possessed to think of taking a saw and cutting a hole in the roof of a $200,000 Ferrari. But to Bam and company, this seems a very natural thing to do. In the show, women are represented in two ways: by the girlfriends of the group members, who are mostly amused by their antics, and by Bam's mother, who provides the horror. She, for example, will come downstairs for breakfast one morning to find an alligator in the middle of the kitchen floor. And then she will say something like this: "Oh, Bam, what have you done?" Now, I suspect that many of you have women friends who correspond to the puzzled but amused girls who are attracted to Bam's club. Perhaps some of them even came to the now infamous FIGAM party earlier this semester. And this year, there have certainly been numerous faculty voices, both female and male, who are doing local imitations of Ape. "Oh, Wabash men, what have you done?" Now, in this address, I want to examine just exactly what it is that you have done. and discuss it in relation to the gender feminist credo that is imposing itself ever more widely in our curriculum. Now, it's been suggested to me that the form of these discussions should be dialogue with faculty colleagues rather than chapel talks to students. Well, I don't think that's really possible. Because, as Professor Webb has made, a point that Professor Wade has made very cogently in print, many faculty begin with presumptions that are so ingrained and so natural to them that meaningful exchange with a person who thinks that these presumptions are totally wrong-headed becomes a hopeless project. Better to let each side state its case, and I think that an objective reckoning would show that there are probably 10 gender feminist presentations formally supported by the college for every one that I feel personally moved to give. Better to let each side state its case and then let students decide what they want to think. And on that score, I feel quite confident that alumni who have known me through the years will agree that on matters beyond the era subjunctive, I am not at all interested in imposing my views on the student body. Rather, I want to present ideas to you, or to use a verb that is beloved of the left, I want to empower you, if you choose, to hold and express opinions which you are otherwise led to believe no intelligent and sophisticated person could possibly entertain. Now, it will no doubt be objected that some of what I will say is misogynistic, a charge that I'm quite ready to face and to rebut. There are two times when I regret that Wabash is not a coeducational college: when we are casting plays, and when my colleagues attempt to convince you that they are speaking for women with a capital W. Well, of course they aren't. And if there were politically and academically conservative female undergraduates here, this would fast become obvious. I recently was in contact with the president of the Princeton Pro-Life Club, a young woman who gives as good as she gets from the feminist establishment at her university. Many of you no doubt have mothers, sisters, and friends who would not at all subscribe to gender feminist ideas. I have certain knowledge that a number of the women who are invaluable co-workers in the college offices don't share these ideas either. In fact, virtually everything that I will present to you today has been said in some form or another by Elizabeth Fox Genovese, Christina Hoff Sommers, Carolyn Graglia, Peggy Noonan, and many other women in our contemporary intelligentsia whose names are so carefully concealed from you in the course of your education here. So I don't think the charge of misogyny will stick. People might also say that it is unfair to lump assorted faculty colleagues together as gender feminists when, as you will hear, I think it's not fair to lump all of you together when talking about objectionable behavior. To this complaint, I would answer that 1/3 of you did not sign a pledge of solidarity with the worst offender among you. Nothing could please me more than if my colleagues want to disavow any or all of the attitudes that I described this morning, and they should feel completely free to abuse me as they do so. So then, the thesis that I wish to set out today has two propositions. First, that at this point in its history, the central mission of Wabash College is to cultivate and defend the dignity of young men and their achievements, intellectual, cultural, and athletic, in a world that increasingly devalues and even demonizes men. And if you doubt this last assertion, just spend a week watching primetime television. Men's roles run the gamut from bumbling idiots to homicidal maniacs. And the only men who can be shown in a positive light are those who have abdicated their masculinity and begun to identify psychologically with women. My second proposition is that the ideology of gender feminism, which to be sure is espoused by both sexes, promotes this devaluation of manhood, notwithstanding loud protest to the contrary by its adherents. Thus, I will claim that as the influence of gender feminism at Wabash grows, the institution becomes more and more unhealthy, until a potential tipping point is reached when our college will cease to be recognizable as itself. It will have been killed quite dead by gender feminists. Already, some will be thinking, how can he talk about masculinity this way? We are being taught that gender roles are socially constructed. Well, what you're being taught is a theory that survives nowhere except in college classrooms, where captive students are forced to endure it. The best explanation for the cult of social constructionism comes from my favorite feminist, Camille Paglia. I quote, "Social constructionism was a crude distortion of the vast 60s cosmic vision. It was promulgated for sectarian purposes by three groups. First, the new 70s breed of Stalinist feminists tried in the abortion crusade to wipe out all reference to nature or religion, a misconceived strategy that backfired and simply strengthened the pro-life position. Second, ambitious literary academics, ignorant of science, used esoteric, language-based social constructionist French theory to advance their careers after the collapse of the academic job market in the 70s. And third, gay activists, after the identification of AIDS in the early 80s, used fascist tactics to stop public discussion of it in anything but political terms, as if disease occurred in people's prejudices rather than in the suffering body, end quote. I do not believe in the social construction of gender, and I am particularly struck by those who do when they, in fact, provide through their activities compelling evidence for the existence of fixed gender types. Let me illustrate this phenomenon with 3 examples. The current round of gender wars on campus appears to have begun with Professor Castro's chapel talk last spring. I was not there when she delivered it, but was told by someone whose opinion I respect that it was truly excellent. Professor Castro was good enough to give me a copy, and when I had finished it, I was a bit puzzled. Surely nobody could argue with the basic premise that one should not unwittingly offend other people. I always try to be quite self-conscious when I mean to be offensive. But there were several aspects of the talk that I found objectionable, and I'll return to some of them later. Why then did my friend, and apparently the whole student body, react so enthusiastically to this speech? I discovered the answer to that question when I looked at the tape that is in our video archives. Professor Castro's delivery was indeed masterful, calm, serene, commanding, a perfect representation of the Demeter archetype, Demeter Semne, Demeter the August, as the Greeks styled her. So it was only natural that a group of well-bred young men would respond as you did, and as the household of King Celius does when in the Homeric hymn Demeter reveals her true identity in a solemn epiphany. My second illustration is much different. It is the talk on hazing that was given recently by a visiting person whose name I'm sorry to say I have completely forgotten. I picked up an article by the speaker that was made available beforehand and thought it really to be the most foolish essay that I had read since the last time I encountered anything written by Michael Kimmel. I thought I would go to the talk and tell the author as much, but in the event, I discovered that she possessed a secret weapon that would defeat my paltry rhetorical talents every time, namely, the ability to bore people absolutely to death. Had I been able to stay to the end of the talk, which I found physically impossible, my first question would have been, is having to sit through this lecture a form of hazing? But I was there long enough to gather an impression. The tailored clothing, the severely pulled back hair, the monotonous tone of voice. Here we had Hera incarnate. Hera, who wears down Zeus by persistence. Yes, Hera, dear, I'll do whatever you say if you will just stop talking. And finally, we have Professor Kinane in her famous letter enacting the archetype of Artemis, the goddess who in a rage shoots arrow after arrow at hapless Actaeon, our student body, with 25 of my co-signing faculty colleagues as the hunting dogs that Artemis turns on their master. If you've taken my myth class, you might remember the famous red-figured vase that depicts this scene. I'll return to the contents of this letter as well later, but before I do, I want to make some more theoretical comments about gender feminism. The single most important thing for you to know about the ideology of gender feminism is that it is a substitute for religion. Again, Camille Paglia's analysis is brilliant. Quote, gender feminists are really religious thinkers who have usually separated in some way from their religious background or their cultural background. They are people looking for an identity, and often they have not really examined their own assumptions at all. So as a consequence, when you challenge them, they become very emotional, end quote. When I think about most of the gender feminists I know, this description is almost frightening in its insight. Gender feminism does indeed occupy the space in person's psyche where religion belongs. It has its own anthropology and its own commandments. The problem is that this anthropology and this catechism are not compatible with those of traditional Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. I can make this point very specifically from the standpoint of my own Roman Catholic faith, which statistics claim is shared by anywhere from a third to a half of the Wabash student body. In 2004, the current Pope, while Cardinal Prefect of the Holy Office, prepared for Pope John Paul II a document titled On the Collaboration of Men and Women in the Church and in the World. And I want to quote for you a passage from it that comments on gender feminism. In order to avoid the domination of one sex over the other, in some ideologies, their differences tend to be denied, viewed as mere effects of historical and cultural conditioning. In this perspective, physical difference, termed sex, is minimized, and the purely cultural element, termed gender, is emphasized to the maximum and held to be primary. Does that sound familiar? This theory of the human person has inspired ideologies which call into question the family in its natural two-parent structure of mother and father. According to this perspective, human nature in itself does not possess characteristics in any absolute manner. All persons can and ought to constitute themselves as they like, since they are free from every predetermination linked to their essential condition. On the contrary, the importance and the meaning of sexual difference as a reality deeply inscribed in man and woman needs to be noted. Sexuality cannot be reduced to a pure and insignificant biological fact, but rather is a fundamental component of personality. Male and female are thus revealed as belonging ontologically to creation and destined, therefore, to outlast the present time. From the first moment of their creation, man and woman are distinct and will remain so for all eternity." End quote. When the late Pope ordered this document to be promulgated on the 31st of May, 2004, it became part of the ordinary magisterium of the Roman Church and thus binding on all the faithful in both the internal and external fora. Now, what individual believers choose to do with this fact is, of course, entirely up to them. But our Catholic students, and I believe I can say our evangelical Christian students as well, should be aware that the basic tenets of gender feminism are contrary to the teachings of the Church and of sacred Scripture. But some of you appreciate that already. God bless fellows like Mike Karam and Trent Rogers, who will never, whether in the classroom or outside it, allow the ancient truths of their faith to be imposed upon by miscellaneous feminist heresies. Now, there's another way to think about gender feminism at Wabash as the equivalent of religion. You may be aware that in the 19th century, the president of the college taught a course in Christian ethics to the whole of the senior class, indicating very directly that all of the learning that went on here did so under the aegis of that faith that informed it. Today, we see calls for the spread of gender feminism to all areas of the curriculum. Gender literary studies, gender rhetoric, gender psychology, gender philosophy. A colleague in music actually apologized publicly for the fact that he couldn't figure out how to get gender into his classes. Gender feminism is thus, for many faculty, now the base on which our academic projects should be grounded, and they want to extend its influence as widely as possible. Gender education in every Wabash classroom is a topic that has actually been seriously discussed. This train of thought reminds me that it is the question of religion at Wabash that made me decide that I had to give this talk today. There were certainly any number of other things I could have spent the Thanksgiving break doing rather than writing it. But an experience that I had had 2 weeks previously compelled me to be here. Some of you will remember Professor Webb's chapel talk last year in which he spoke about the intellectual persecution of Christian students at Wabash. I heard many, many people say afterwards that this was an absurd exaggeration. Well, they might want to think again. We had on campus recently a consultant who was here to help us with the search for a new dean, and I was part of a small group of faculty who met with him. At the end of our conversation, he asked if there were any particular problems or challenges at Wabash that candidates for this position should be aware of. One of my colleagues responded quite nonchalantly, "The problem I see is that there are too many conservative Christian students at Wabash. Wabash is at risk of turning into a Christian college." Now, my own religious commitments are not exactly a secret on campus, but I couldn't really be angry with my colleague since insulting Christianity is taken as such an ordinary part of contemporary academic life that I don't think it occurs to people that when they do it, they're being offensive. But it does behoove those of you who are sitting here today and who identify yourselves as conservative Christians to know that in some Wabash circles, you are considered a problem to be solved by the new dean. Professor Webb is not paranoid, he's simply a prophet. prophets are notoriously without honor in their own countries, but the administration might want to take a look at the enrollment statistics for the spring semester. There are 89 students who have signed up for Professor Webb's class, The Christian Church in the Modern Era. There are 51 students in his Historical Jesus, which I know many are particularly anxious to take this year, and there are 43 in the Apostle Paul. The student body is making it abundantly clear what it wants to learn. Will the future administration listen? Or will it continue the policy of allowing faculty to force gender feminism down the throats of Wabash men? No student should have to write to me what one did last spring. I quote, "I just spent my last semester wasting a credit hour on," and he names the course. "The description of this class was deceiving. I thought I was going to be reading some of my favorite books. What it turned out to be was a criticism of all masculine constructs and deconstructionist gender feminism see the sexist style readings of the text. One of my favorite passages in one of the books was whittled down to a look at the overpowering sexist dominance of the main character. I still have a bad taste in my mouth." Now, is this the kind of thing that you expected when you heard Mr. Klein talk to you about Wabash College? I know it's sometimes said that we must compel students to study precisely the things that they are not comfortable with and are not familiar to them. But turnabout is fair play. I wonder how much time my gender feminist colleagues spend reading around in John Paul II's theology of the body. Not much, I suspect. Here, let me insert an aside. After I had closed my document, precisely at this point when I was writing it, I turned to read my email. And there was a note from a recent alumnus who's now in Chicago in law school. I just want to quote a sentence from it. He said to me, "I told X, a young Catholic who wants to transfer out of Wabash, to go talk to you because he didn't think he could learn anything about Catholicism at the college." Indeed, recent history has shown that the opinions of Catholic students about the teaching of religion at Wabash are not, in fact, taken very seriously. But I want to return now to Professor Castro's talk and to make some observations on it. My chief complaint about the speech was that it began a phenomenon that has become a trend in campus discourse, what I would call the creation of Wabash urban legends. This process has two parts. First, one repeats something that reflects badly on a student that one has heard second, third, or fourth hand, or in some cases, something that might have occurred decades ago. At one point, Professor Castro referred to oral tradition as the source of an anecdote. Well, the courts have a name for this kind of material, and it's called hearsay. It's not admissible as evidence. The second part of creating a Wabash urban legend is then to generalize the behavior of a particular errant person to the whole of the student body, as if you were each responsible for what the other says and does. An example, I have never in my life heard anybody talk about raping someone with sandpaper, nor has any student I have asked about this ever heard such an expression. But assuming it was said, three levels of reaction seem to me appropriate. If it's said to you and you don't like it, we'll tell the person. If you hear that someone is actually raping a third party with sandpaper, we'll then call the police. But if you were told that some unnamed person used the phrase in conversation with some other unnamed person, then realize that there will always be loutish people in the world and just try and stay out of their way. But as Christina Hoff Sommers has written in her book, Who Stole Feminism? One of the chief things you have to remember about gender feminists is that, like Thucydides' Athenians, they are hopeless busybodies. How far have we fallen, gentlemen, when we are willing to use against our own students information gleaned from faculty molds in the Bon Appetit kitchen staff? When I am dining at Taillevent, I do not expect my conversation to be of interest to the busboys, nor should you when you're eating in the Sparks Center. And what about this supposed incident of poor behavior in the library? Who among us has not occasionally been frustrated at the absence of a human being behind the circulation desk? A few questions would have revealed that the students involved in this incident were simply trying to get somebody's attention, man, woman, or child, they didn't care. Insulting the opposite sex was the last thing in their minds. Then there was the poster in the library that was adduced to show how a student had tacked up some very unseemly comments about his ex-girlfriend. Never having been a 19-year-old man, Professor Castro may be unaware that 100 fellows could have walked past that flyer without paying the slightest attention to it. This is a natural difference between the sexes. Men are capable of a much higher level of oblivious abstraction than are women. But Professor Castro did not imagine that, and so she simply said that evidently no students objected to the posting of the sign. Well, she couldn't have known that, and she shouldn't have claimed it, to the detriment of your collective reputation. This year, the gender campaign started when, in a faculty meeting, we were informed that the Phi Gams had sponsored a party dubbed CEOs and Office Hoes, the famous party. Well, when I heard this, my first thought was that the title was a parody of an episode from the Jerry Springer Show, which, by the way, is the subject of an opera that has premiered very successfully in London. My attitude about this affair was and is that unless a faculty member had been invited to the party, it was none of his or her business what it was called. If the dean of students objected to it, as well he might have, it was up to him to make his displeasure known and to provide guidelines for future events. You must, gentlemen, get the faculty out of your private lives. I can't stress this too strongly, because if you don't, I promise you the time will come when the freshman orientation packet will contain a sheet listing unacceptable masturbatory fantasies. And if you are inclined to doubt the radical intentions of at least one of my colleagues, look again at the manifesto that Professor Aden circulated via email on the 31st of October, which, by the way, my lawyer tells me contains a libel against me and Professor Webb that would certainly be actionable in law. Professor Aden says, when a woman member of our community articulates that their human rights have been assailed, there is no need for more evidence, end quote. When you are forced to make what might be somebody's fantasy into your reality, you're living in a fascist state. There's one more comment I want to make about Professor Castro's chapel speech. Towards the end, she remarks that a woman is raped every 7 seconds. Christina Hoff Sommers, in her book, devotes an entire chapter to this and many other statistics that gender feminists routinely quote, and which she, I think, successfully proves are not at all true. The purpose of talking to you constantly about rape and domestic violence, even over the DePauw weekend of all times, is, of course, to make you feel collective guilt about being men. There's only one original sin, gentlemen, and it was committed by Adam and Eve. I think you should reject these attempts to convict you of other people's moral failings. You should also know that, in fact, the largest percentage of domestic violence in this country is committed by women against their children. And I'm only talking about children who are injured and killed after they're born. Department of Justice figures show that between 1993 and 1997, of people incarcerated for murder, 10.5% of women were in prison for killing their children versus 2.2% of the men. Unfortunately, there is a Medea archetype too. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if there's not a single one of you sitting here today who has or ever will be tempted to act violently towards a woman. So the next time someone begins to lecture you about rape and domestic violence, you might want to tell them to go down to the local jail where the audience might actually need their help. Now I turn to Professor Kinane's letter to the bachelor. What are we to make of it? Well, I pondered that question for quite a while and talked to people, looked at the general outline of the situation, and this is my conclusion. I think the whole thing was cooked up as a stunt to embarrass the college when it is looking for a new dean and president. Something to trot out as evidence that we need gender feminist administrators to control our student body. Now, I say it was a cooked-up stunt, and I have a good idea where the recipe was created. When the event was announced, I said to a senior member of the administration that I thought it was not perhaps a good idea for the college to support a conference limited to female faculty, since it would no doubt be controlled by gender feminists and used as a planning session for future agitation. I was assured that the organizers were not that kind of feminist. Well, when the conference ended, a spokeswoman for the group made this portentous announcement: Wabash students must become more aware of their gendered identity. Gentlemen, if when you are standing in front of a urinal you can't figure out what your gendered identity is, Wabash College can't help you. We were told that a report to the full faculty would be made after this conference about its proceedings. None has been forthcoming. Or has it? I strongly suspect Professor Kinane's letter represents a fairly accurate account of what occurred, where, quote, conversations among faculty and staff about student sexism, end quote, went on, and where the very, very strange idea of a diversity audit was dreamed up. Let me go on public record as saying that I strenuously object to official Wabash support of some subset of the faculty, restricted by sex or anything else, going off and creating an agenda which the full faculty is not privy to. I don't think this is the way a college should function. Back to Professor Kinane's letter. The words sexist and sexism occur 14 times. As a philologist, I know how to count words. Personally, I long ago repudiated these words, and I don't involve myself in any discussions which make use of them, because I cannot recognize terms which have no fixed meaning. I can understand what lust is. I can understand what injustice is, but I don't have a clue what sexism is. I know what it won't be, and that is whatever a particular gender feminist wants it to be for the occasion of the discussion. Professor Kinane's definition offered on Blackboard was truly mind-boggling to me. Sexism, she tells us, is, quote, treating a person in a different way because of his or her sex or gender, end quote. Well, if you plan on having a family someday, I wouldn't pay too much attention to that idea. But gender feminists are not very strong when it comes to biology, and I would claim they're not very strong when it comes to ethics either. Consider the Victorian shock at the DePaul t-shirts and at the Playboy centerfolds, which apparently appeared at Chapel Sing, although I can't say I saw them. For members of the faculty to censure you for these things, while at the same time encouraging and even compelling you to attend the vagina monologues, where you were asked to chant in chorus the most obscene word in the English language. For members of the faculty to censure you for these things, while supporting the appearance here of a pornography collection amassed by the sexual predator Alfred Kinsey, this, gentlemen, to my mind, is grotesque moral hypocrisy. I think, too, of the poster that announced the lecture on hazing. It depicted an agonized-looking man tied to a flagpole. The intention, of course, was to inspire you with horror at collegiate initiation rites. But if it had been a scene from a sadomasochistic movie made by a cutting-edge gay director, Professor Lee would no doubt be lecturing you on how wonderful it was. Another thing to remember about gender feminists, and this has been said quite directly by one of them, they don't believe in morality, they only believe in politics. Well, what then are we to make of all of this? Frankly, I am not all that optimistic about the prospects for our future administration. We are beginning to appreciate the fact that ideas do have consequences, as gender feminists are now in line to occupy important administrative posts and have announced their intention of securing a dean who is to their liking. And why it is that they won't be opposed by other colleagues who don't share their views could be the subject of an entire other talk. But I've never believed in public causes, really, only private ones. And so institutional structures don't really interest me that much. I want to end this morning with some advice to you as individual men, advice that may perhaps have an effect on how the new administration of the college will turn out. At the end of her talk, Professor Castro recited a string of obscene words and then humorously added that it wasn't her purpose to be getting her jollies by talking dirty in the chapel. In my conclusion, I want to use just one of these words, and my purpose is not cheap thrills either. It is to make it quite clear that so long as I am a member of the Wabash faculty, speech and behavior on this campus will not be controlled by gender feminists. So let's return to where we started, to my new TV enthusiasm, Viva la Bam. In the intro of each episode, there is a voiceover that asks the question about Bam, what will he do next? It's quite a profound question, really, if you think about it. Whether it is in your interactions and relationships with women, in your academic and future professional lives, or in your experiences as husbands, fathers, and citizens, you will always be asking yourself, what will I do next? How will you decide what you should respond? Well, I don't think the answer is to be found in any of the gender classes that Professor Kinane and her friends recommend that you run out and enroll in. I propose to you 3 sources of enlightenment in your moral judgments. First and most important are the ethical imperatives of the great religious traditions of which you are the heirs: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and the many others. The wisdom of your ancestors in faith will never lead you astray. Next, there is the influence of figures you have encountered here in your studies. Achilles, returning the body of Hector. Augustine, deciding that nothing in life is more important than God. Proust, on his deathbed, in that cork-lined room, adding to and correcting his great novel to the very end. And finally, you have the example of Wabash men, stretching back 173 years from our founders kneeling in the snow to the brave veterans of the Civil War whose names are found on the east side of Center Hall, right down to men like Eric Dean and Lou Salter, who were such an inspiration to me at the start of my Wabash career. In the future, when you make moral decisions, think, gentlemen, about what these sources of guidance are telling you. And if you do, then you can, I think, with complete liberty, give our friend Bam's answer to the question, what will I do next? You can say very simply, whatever the fuck I want. Thank you.